Hello everyone, I know you watched this video to accompany you to sleep. So if you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, don't forget to tell me where you are from and what time you watched this video. Let's jump straight into the story. Story 1. It's pretty exciting to admit to your parents the decision to play your own wedding. Tina Thomas was a lot more nervous than her fiancé, Gabe Watson. Tina was 26 years old at the time, just like her future husband, and this was her third serious relationship and second attempt at a wedding. Her first attempt to build a family with boyfriend Scott McCulloch ended in failure. No, the relationship between young people were just fine, but only Tina's mother was against this wedding, and Scott himself she did not like. There were no specific claims, but like every mother, she wanted a better and happier life for her daughter and Tina herself. At that moment was still very young. For this reason, the couple soon parted. The mirage of a joint future melted away. The second attempt, with Stan Marks, also failed. Here Tina's parents did not play any role. The couple could not overcome the first 3-year crisis, and they parted by mutual consent. Finally, on Christmas Eve, at a party of friends, Tina meets Gabe Watson. We can't say it was love at first sight, on the contrary. The relationship was built more as mutual support for each other after a recent breakup. Yes, perhaps this is not the most joyful reason to start building a new relationship, but 2 years later Gabe proposed marriage to Tina. Tina, having learned from bitter experience, said she agreed but couldn't do it without parental blessing. In 2003, Gabe decided like a real prince, beautifully and romantically appealed to the parents of his chosen one and chose Valentine's Day, but Tina's father was away. So the dinner was moved to the next day. On February 15th, during the dinner, when Watson voiced his decision to live with Tina all his life hand in hand, the father of the bride asked a seemingly simple question to the groom. Does he love Tina? Gabe stammered like a schoolboy but never answered. His father considered this reaction to be a common embarrassment among strangers. Then he asked his daughter the same question. Surprisingly, Tina did not answer this question directly either, but began her speech by saying that she was afraid of being alone at the age of 26. The father thought for a while and blessed the young ones. Preparing for a wedding takes a lot of time and effort, and while Tina was thinking about her outfit, her guests, and the whole wedding, Gabe was only planning the honeymoon. He didn't care at all how his future wife wanted to spend her vacation. He had already decided everything for her. His plan was to go to the Great Barrier Reef, which is located in the Pacific Ocean near Australia, and go diving there. First of all, to look at the sunken ship, the Townsville Titanic, which sank back in 1911. The problem was that Tina, unlike Gabe, wasn't into diving. Yes, he took her scuba diving in the pool sometimes, in calm water under the supervision of lifeguards, but no more than that. Gabe himself was an experienced scuba diver. He was completing a rescue diving course, and had over 50 dives to his credit at the time, and of course it wasn't in a pool. If you don't learn to dive by our honeymoon, I'm warning you right away. You're staying home, walking the dog, or pruning roses in the garden. You're not going anywhere with me, said Gabe. Tina had no choice. In fact, Gabe even took out a loan to buy her own equipment and pay for her fiancé's classes. The first instructor Tina had taken lessons with was disappointed in her skills, and even warned Gabe that his fiancée had absolutely no skills for open ocean swimming. A furious Gabe wouldn't listen to the diving instructor, accusing him of being the one who couldn't explain, and refused to continue the class. The second instructor rather quickly gave Tina a credit, although then, and noted that Tina does everything from under the stick, solely to please her future husband. On October 11th, the young couple finally got married, and after 2 days, Tina and Gabe flew to Australia, spending on a trip of $10,000, which gave them for the wedding. It should be noted that Gabe devoted part of the honeymoon to Tina. They walked around Sydney, visited the Sydney Aquarium and the zoo. Tina was excited, but the closer they got to going to the Great Barrier Reef, the sadder she became. On the morning of October 21st, they flew to Townsville, and in the evening boarded a boat to one of the most beautiful places on Earth and every diver's dream. After a while, employees of the diving company will tell that in fact, the couple did not look like experienced divers, and even Gabe, who had graduated from courses and had experience behind him, could hardly understand the equipment, as if he saw it for the first time in his life. But nevertheless, it was he who helped Tina to pass the exam before diving, although such a test should be conducted separately. And when the instructor offered Tina his help underwater, she refused. It was also noted in the dive log that there was a strong current that day, and this moment in history should not be missed or glossed over. Gabe, as I said, helped his wife sort out the equipment they had bought back in the US and went to get the tanks they had to rent. Gabe took an 11-liter tank for himself and gave his wife an 8.5-liter tank, which for this place was an extremely small volume or even dangerous. Given Tina's experience, or rather lack thereof, it was not possible to descend to the Townsville Titanic from the first time Tina asked for additional cargo, because she could not dive to depth, and Gabe at first did not work underwater computer, which calculates the necessary speed of diving and ascent, as well as shows the amount of oxygen in the cylinders. After returning to the boat, the computer worked, and they tried again. The wreck was 49 feet deep, and Tina was the first to submerge, Gabe swimming behind her. From Gabe's statement, at first, everything was fine. At some point, Tina stopped, started waving at me, and later signaled that she wanted to go up. I realized right away that she was just panicking. She used to do that. By this time, we were halfway up. So I decided to calm her down and stay with her at the same depth for a while, without further diving, so that she could psychologically get used to the pressure. She continued to breathe very deeply, which was unsafe, and that's when I noticed she was sinking. I tried to grab her belt to hold her down, but she swung her arms so hard that she knocked the mask off my face. While I was putting the mask back on my face, though it didn't take long, Tina was already too far away from me. For a while I tried to swim to her, but I was unsuccessful. Then I decided to return to the surface to ask for help from the lifeguards. On the way, I met another swimmer with a narrow-set eye, but he paid no attention to my signs for help. Yes, there were 2 Asian men with them at depth, but neither of them confirmed Gabe's words about his request for help. Later, when the police took underwater computer readings, they confirmed that Gabe did try to swim after his drowning wife for a while, but eventually gave up the attempt very quickly. Although the ascent to the surface itself was not an emergency, on the contrary, Gabe surfaced as instructed, stopping at each required depth level. As for the other divers, each of them, when questioned by police, claimed that Gabe could have saved his wife, but he simply did not. In addition, this tragic incident occurred at the very beginning of their dive, and therefore Gabe had enough oxygen in his tanks to swim to the bottom and return back to the surface. The rescuers on duty on the ship, as soon as they realized what had happened, immediately went in search of Tina and found her very quickly. But unfortunately, it was too late. Tina was lying on her back with her eyes open under her mask at a depth of 82 feet. Her body was immediately lifted up, and on the deck of the yacht they gave her artificial respiration for about 40 minutes. But to no avail, Tina died. Gabe all this time did not come close to his wife, but only stood somewhere aside and, according to witnesses, naively sniffed his nose. The same employees of the company said that the young man on the way to the shore and smiled, and even played cards with other passengers. Gabe denied this in court. The subsequent autopsy of Tina showed that not everything was so clear. Yes, there are no signs of obvious violent death, but there are bruises on the neck. There are traces of blood in the nostrils, which is also common at the 82-foot depth where Tina's body was found. There are no traces of alcohol in the blood, but there are high levels of drugs, such as ibuprofen and paracetamol, although these drugs are used in the treatment of seasickness. A small amount of fluid was seen in the lungs. The report stated that Tina died from drowning, but it is possible that she drowned while already deprived of oxygen. Tina's gear was checked by the Australian Water Police, but no malfunctions were noted. The police could have written it off as an accident. An inexperienced diver ignored safety rules and paid for it with his life. A very common case, unfortunately, but only there were suspicious moments in this story, such as rather ambiguous results of the autopsy. Also, according to the diving team, strange behavior of Watson, which does not fit into the conventional picture, where the husband grieves for his wife who just died. All these factors did not give so easily close the case, and that's why the investigation was taking quite a long time. In addition, Tina's parents did not want to accept what had happened as a tragic accident and wanted to see their son-in-law in the dock, if not as the murderer of their daughter, then at least as a man who had not helped her. During the first interrogation, the police noted that the suspect was in shock, crying and laughing, twitching nervously, asking to call his father, who complained of pain in his ears and begging him to tell his wife's parents about the tragedy. Late at night, Gabe was released. He went to the yacht that belonged to the company that sent them to the reef and asked them for a night's lodging, arguing that the trip was supposed to last 2 days, but because his wife had died, they had only been there for 24 hours. He also asked for a refund of half of the cost of their dive. In fact, he never got to see the sunken ship. On October 24th, Gabe's mother flies to Townsville to support her son and help him find a lawyer. That same day, at Gabe's request, they go to the morgue. Gabe wanted to see his wife one more time. Because the husband was still considered a suspect, the morgue employee called the detective who was in charge of the case. In theory, Gabe could have hidden some evidence, but the grief-stricken husband only cried, held his wife's cold hand, and begged her forgiveness, not realizing at all that the police officer was standing outside the door at the time, recording him on a tape recorder. "I didn't mean to hurt you." These are the words Detective Lawrence later uses against Gabe in court. Then at the morgue, "You told Tina you didn't mean to hurt her. What did you mean by that?" Lawrence will ask his question. The story of Gabe's sore ear was repeated again as he was traveling home with his wife's body. During a layover in Oakland, he sought medical attention on the airport grounds and was held there for evaluation. According to the investigation, this was done on purpose to avoid seeing Tina's father. However, and divers will confirm this, ear problems are a fairly common ailment among divers. Tina's funeral was held on November 5th, where Gabe still had to meet with the deceased's father. Gabe, almost in full view of everyone, took off his wife's wedding ring, putting it on his ring finger over hers, as well as earrings, which he immediately handed over to his father-in-law. Watson and the Thomas family never crossed paths again that day. Later in the trial, Gabe would be asked the question, "Did you really take your wife's jewelry off during the funeral?" Gabe will only smile and shrug, "I don't think I could have done it later." Everyone had different opinions about Gabe. Some said that this chubby funny man was quite a kind man, and some on the contrary called him a tyrant and a despot. But they all agreed on one thing. Gabe and Tina were not happy, or at least they didn't seem to be. Tina's friends confirmed what she'd told her father at a family dinner on February 15th. Her union with Gabe was just a way to avoid dying alone, and that fear had led Tina to die on the seabed. Also, the victim, who died shortly before their honeymoon, confessed to a friend that her husband dragged her by the hand to an insurance company, where he forced her to insure his life at a higher interest rate in case of death, and put his name in the column beneficiary. This testimony was checked through the insurance agent, and he confirmed everything. The cab driver who drove the newlyweds to the yacht was also questioned. Tina cried the whole way, but her husband paid no attention to her. Finally, Tina's friend Amanda Phillips told another story, and it became clear what the couple's relationship was really like. This damn jerk videotaped Tina urinating in the bathroom, and then edited it and put it in a tape of them celebrating Christmas. That would have been okay, but he turned it on at a general viewing with a full house of guests. He laughed like a horse, while everyone twiddled their fingers around their temples and tried to explain to him that it was a very low act. I was clutching crosses on my fingers so Tina wouldn't get the idea to marry him. While removing jewelry right during a funeral may seem like a frightening and denunciatory act on Gabe's part, during the trial, in 2008, the jury was shown an extremely disturbing footage of Watson visiting Tina's grave, taking all the flowers from it and carrying them away. They were later found in a nearby trash can. Tina's father noticed the missing flowers, and to find out the thief, he set up a hidden camera in the next row among the monuments. But he never expected to see Gabe on the tape, and was outraged by such an act. In court, Gabe's defense was that he and his wife had discussed the death of one of their own on an extreme honeymoon, and the lack of flowers on the grave was her request, which sounded very strange and unlikely. There's no telling how long the search for evidence would have dragged on if the cops had put on the exact same gear the newlyweds had and hadn't tried to stage that incident. Gabe said Tina drowned while he was trying to put a mask on her face. It turned out it was impossible to put the mask on underwater by yourself unless you used another source of air, in this case, Tina's oxygen. In late November 2008, the Australian police arrested Gabe, and on June 5, 2009, Gabe's trial began where he pleaded guilty, but only to failing to save his wife. So he was charged with negligent homicide and sent to prison for 18 months. After completing his sentence, Gabe returned home to the U.S., but a year later, the now U.S. court charged him with first-degree murder, the motive for which was to receive insurance payments after the death of his wife. Gabe's lawyer tried to defend his client, shifting all the blame on the diving company, that the employees of this company did not take care of the safety of tourists, and now afraid of losing their license, and therefore the whole business, are trying to shift the blame on the unhappy husband, who has already served his time in another country. As for the money received from the insurance company, the payout amounted to $33,000, while Gabe spent much more money on lawyers and additional expertise. Nevertheless, the prosecution continued to insist that this spending was only because the husband could not assume that he would not be believed, and also the prosecutor refused to accept the fact that Gabe, with a degree in drowning rescue in hand, could not even save his wife. When Gabe had his say, he addressed the jury. "It's been 7 years since the tragedy, and there hasn't been a day that I haven't thought about that terrible day. The public has pounced on me, blaming me for my wife's death, calling me a murderer. There wasn't a single person who looked me in the eye and said, 'Yes, I understand how bad you feel, but it's not your fault.' On the contrary, everyone just wants me dead. And here I can only understand my late wife's parents. Yes, they will never forgive me, no matter how much I kneel before them, and no matter how much I beg their forgiveness. You often hear the phrase, 'I can't imagine what it's like to lose a child.' But I've never heard anyone say, 'I can't imagine what it's like to lose a wife, especially on a honeymoon.' If I can be accused of anything, it's that I didn't make enough effort to save Tina. But I've already received my punishment for that. Perhaps you all would have been satisfied if I had drowned with my wife then, 7 years ago. But I was afraid to die, afraid I wouldn't be able to rise from the bottom to the top. I just wanted to live, as I still want to live now." No evidence of Gabe's guilt was presented to the court. The jury found Gabe not guilty. What do you guys think? Is Gabe guilty of Tina's death? Story 2. The rain had been falling steadily for hours, a constant reminder of the tension that hung in the air. The streets of Amsterdam were slick with water, and the dim streetlights flickered through the haze, casting eerie shadows on the cobblestone roads. The city, known for its canals and bicycles, now seemed to pulse with a darker energy, a reflection of the undercurrent of crime that had been slowly creeping through its veins. Detective Martin de Vries stood in the middle of the bridge, looking down at the water as it swirled beneath him. His coat was heavy with the weight of the rain, but it was the weight of the case that truly burdened him. It had been 2 days since the body of Willem de Haan, a notorious drug kingpin, had been found dumped in the canal, and the investigation had turned into a nightmare. No leads, no witnesses, just the body, a well-dressed, well-known figure with connections that stretched across Europe, now dead under mysterious circumstances. Martin had been working in Amsterdam's police force for over 15 years, and in all that time, he'd never seen a case like this. The murder of Willem de Haan wasn't just a killing, it was a message. Someone had gone through great lengths to ensure that this was no ordinary hit. Willem wasn't just a criminal, he was a symbol, an icon of Amsterdam's underground world. His empire had spanned from narcotics to arms dealing, and his influence had touched nearly every part of the city. The man who had killed him was sending a message, but to whom? And why? As Martin stood there, his mind began to turn over the few facts they had. Willem had been involved in a high-profile deal just days before his death, a meeting that had gone sour. The deal had been about more than just drugs. It had involved a large shipment of illegal arms, a shipment that Willem had promised to deliver to a powerful group in Eastern Europe. The details were fuzzy, and the authorities had been left in the dark. But one thing was clear. Someone had been unhappy with the way Willem had been running things. De Vries. A voice interrupted his thoughts, pulling him back to reality. He turned to see his partner, Eva Jansen, walking briskly toward him. She had been with him on the case from the beginning, and though she was younger, she had a sharp mind and an even sharper instinct. She carried herself with a cool confidence that Martin appreciated. "Any updates?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. Eva handed him a folder, her face tense. "We've got a lead. Not much, but it's something." She glanced around, as if making sure no one else was watching, before continuing. "We spoke to a few of Willem's associates. Most of them are tight-lipped, but one of them mentioned something about a woman, someone who's been seen with Willem recently. They didn't know much about her, but she's been around a lot, particularly in the days leading up to his death." Martin frowned, scanning the contents of the folder. "A woman? This is the first I'm hearing of this. You think she had something to do with it?" Eva shrugged. "It's hard to say, but I don't like the coincidence. The fact that Willem was involved in such a big deal, and now we have this mystery woman showing up in the middle of it. It could be nothing, or it could be the key to cracking this whole thing wide open." Martin nodded slowly. His mind was already racing with possibilities. There had been rumors for years about a secret network of women who were working as intermediaries in the criminal underworld, women who were skilled at keeping a low profile and managing the affairs that men couldn't. It was a system that operated beneath the surface, a quiet force of manipulation and control. Could this woman be one of them? "Where do we start?" he asked, closing the folder and tucking it under his arm. Eva looked up at him, determination in her eyes. "We start with the last place Willem was seen, his club. It's the one place where we know he felt safe, but also the one place where he made his biggest mistakes." Martin's stomach tightened. The club was a notorious hotspot in the heart of Amsterdam's red light district. It had been a frequent location for shady deals and illicit meetings, and though it had a reputation for being a place where the city's elite came to mingle, it was also known as the place where criminals gathered to hatch their plots. Willem's club was as much a part of his identity as his criminal empire. If there was any clue to be found, it would be there. The two detectives made their way through the narrow streets, the cold air biting at their skin as they approached the club. The building loomed over them, a hulking structure with dim lights that spilled out into the wet streets. A bouncer stood guard at the entrance, his eyes scanning the crowd as they approached. Martin didn't bother with pleasantries. He simply flashed his badge. "We need to speak with the manager," he said, his voice steady. The bouncer hesitated for a moment before nodding and stepping aside to let them pass. Inside, the club was dark, the air thick with the scent of alcohol and the low hum of music. The crowd seemed to blur together in the dim light, their faces a mixture of indifference and curiosity. This was Willem's world, a world that Martin had never fully understood, but had grown to despise. The lies, the deceit, and the manipulation. It all revolved around money and power, and the people here would do anything to protect that. They found the manager in the back office, nervously pacing as if he knew they were coming. The man looked up at the two detectives as they entered, his eyes darting between them. He was sweating, his face pale, but Martin knew better than to expect anything resembling honesty. "What can I do for you, detectives?" the manager asked, his voice tight. "We're investigating Willem de Haan's death," Martin said, his tone sharp. "We need information. Everything you know about the last few days he spent here." The manager swallowed hard. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say anything, Martin cut him off. "Start with the woman," he said. "The one who was seen with him in the days leading up to his death." The manager's eyes widened, a flash of recognition crossing his face. But it was gone as quickly as it came. He seemed to think for a moment before finally speaking. "I don't know her name," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But she was here a lot. Always with Willem. Always in the VIP section. She was different. Quiet, mysterious." Martin leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Where is she now?" The manager hesitated. "She disappeared after Willem was killed. No one's seen her since." The manager's words hung in the air like a thick fog, and Martin could feel his pulse quicken. The woman was the key. That much was certain. Willem's death, the secrecy surrounding her, and the sudden disappearance. Everything pointed towards something much larger than a simple street-level hit. Martin exchanged a glance with Eva, who seemed to be piecing the puzzle together in her own mind. They needed to find this woman, and they needed to find her fast. "Tell us more about her," Eva urged, her voice calm yet commanding. "What can you remember? Anything at all?" The manager wrung his hands nervously, his eyes flicking to the door as if expecting someone to come barging in at any moment. "She wasn't from around here, that much I'm sure of," he said. "She had an accent, maybe Eastern European. She didn't talk much. But whenever she did, it was clear she was in charge. Not Willem, not anyone. She was in control." Martin leaned back, thinking over what the manager had said. An Eastern European accent. Someone in control. That didn't sound like a typical associate of Willem's crew. They were used to dealing with tough, brash men, people who wore their power like a badge. But this woman, whoever she was, had a subtle form of authority, a quiet menace that seemed to demand respect. Did she ever mention where she was from? Or anything about her past? Martin pressed. The manager shook his head, looking genuinely frustrated. "No, nothing. I tried to get her to talk, but she never gave anything away. But I did hear her arguing with Willem once. It was in the back office, about a deal gone bad. Something about a shipment that was late, and a buyer who wasn't happy. Willem was nervous. She was calm, like it didn't matter." Martin's mind raced. A shipment that was late. A nervous Willem. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. Willem had always been confident in his dealings. He never showed fear. But for this woman to make him nervous, she had to be someone powerful. Someone who could play the game on a level he couldn't even comprehend. "We need to find her," Eva said firmly, snapping Martin out of his thoughts. "Now." Martin nodded, his eyes narrowing. I agree, but we can't just ask around. Whoever she is, she's smart. She'll be watching for anyone asking questions about her. We'll have to be careful. The manager seemed to sag with relief at the detective's decision to leave. He knew all too well the consequences of getting involved in Willem's affairs. Still, there was something about the way he looked at them, something almost grateful, as though he was relieved they were taking the reins. As they left the office, the dim light of the club seemed to swallow them, and the noise of the crowd grew louder, the beats of the music reverberating through the walls. Martin and Eva walked out into the cold night air, the rain still falling relentlessly. They both knew the stakes had just gotten much higher. I'll reach out to my contacts in Eastern Europe, Eva said as they headed toward their car. Maybe they know something about her. If she's really from that part of the world, we might be able to trace her. Martin nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. I think it's time we pay a visit to the man who bought those illegal arms from Willem. He might have some answers. Eva gave him a sidelong glance. You think he knows more about her? I do. Willem was just the middleman. This woman is more than just an accomplice. She's part of something bigger. And if we can connect her to the arms deal, we'll have our lead. The drive to the buyer's location was tense. Both detectives were lost in their thoughts, their minds running through the possibilities of what they might uncover. As they reached the warehouse on the outskirts of the city, Martin's phone buzzed. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It's from my source in the police force, he said, his voice grim. Willem's accountant is missing. No one's heard from him since the night of the murder. Eva's eyes widened. The accountant? He must know something. Maybe he was involved in this deal, or maybe he knows more about this woman. Martin slammed his fist against the steering wheel in frustration. We need to find him now. If he's been kidnapped or worse, he's our last chance to find the answers we need. Without another word, Martin floored the accelerator, the tires screeching as they sped toward the accountant's apartment. They had no idea what they were walking into, but one thing was certain. The case was spiraling out of control, and the deeper they dug, the darker it became. As they arrived at the building, Martin's instincts told him that something was wrong. The usual lights were off in the apartment complex, and the atmosphere was eerily quiet. Eva was already on the phone with their backup, coordinating with the team to search the building. Martin's hand went to his gun, his grip tight. He could feel the tension building in his chest as they ascended the stairs. Every step felt heavier than the last. When they reached the accountant's door, it was unlocked. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a scene of disarray. The furniture was overturned, and papers were scattered across the floor. But it was the bloodstain near the desk that caught Martin's attention. The accountant had been here, and he had fought for his life. Get ready, Martin muttered to Eva. We don't know who or what we're dealing with. Eva nodded, her expression grim. Let's move. They moved cautiously through the apartment, the creak of the floorboards beneath their feet sounding too loud in the oppressive silence. Martin's heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the room. Everything seemed off, too clean, too methodical. The overturned furniture, the disheveled papers. It was as if someone had been searching for something. But what? Eva knelt down beside the bloodstain, carefully examining it. It's fresh, she muttered. Not even a day old. Martin nodded grimly. They took him. Whoever this is, they're sending a message. But why leave all this evidence behind? It doesn't add up. Eva stood up and moved toward the desk. She carefully sifted through the papers scattered across the floor, pulling out receipts and documents. Here, she said, holding up a small folder. This might be something. Martin stepped over to her, taking the folder from her hands. It was a set of contracts and bank statements, all related to the arms deal. But what caught his eye was a specific name that appeared multiple times, a name he hadn't expected to see. Olga Mikhailov, Martin whispered, his stomach tightening. The name matched the description of the mysterious woman from the club. This is her. She's involved in this deal. Eva's eyes widened in realization. She's not just a criminal. She's the mastermind behind all of this, isn't she? Martin didn't answer immediately. His mind was racing. Everything was starting to fall into place. Olga Mikhailov wasn't just an accomplice or a partner in crime. She was the one pulling the strings, and Willem had been a pawn in her game. The fact that she'd used him to distribute illegal weapons was bad enough, but now, with the accountant missing and the bloody trail leading straight to her, it was clear that Olga was playing a dangerous game, and they were deep in the middle of it. They moved swiftly through the apartment, checking every corner for any further clues. Eva found a piece of paper crumpled beneath a chair, and when she flattened it out, the address on it made her freeze. It was the location of a warehouse on the outskirts of Amsterdam, a place that Martin knew well, one that had been flagged by authorities months ago for its suspicious activity. "This is it," Martin said, a grim determination settling over him. "This is where the weapons are stored, and if Olga is there, we might be able to stop this before it goes any further." Eva's jaw set in resolve. "Let's go." The drive to Amsterdam was a blur of flashing lights and hurried conversations. Martin couldn't shake the image of the accountant's blood-stained apartment from his mind. Whoever had taken him had done it with brutal efficiency. And now, they were on the trail of the woman at the heart of this conspiracy, Olga Mikhailov, the shadow behind Willem's criminal empire. As they neared the warehouse, Martin's phone buzzed. It was a text from their backup team. "All units in position. Awaiting orders." He glanced at Eva. "This is it. We move in together, fast and silent. No mistakes." Eva nodded, her grip tightening on her gun. "Understood." They parked a few blocks away and approached the warehouse on foot. The area was desolate, the buildings around them dark and abandoned. The air felt thick with tension as they moved through the shadows, careful to avoid being seen. They reached the door to the warehouse, which was slightly ajar. Martin motioned for Eva to take the left side while he covered the right. They slipped inside, the faint sound of their footsteps drowned out by the hum of old machines and the distant drip of water. The inside of the warehouse was cavernous, its shadows stretching out like dark veins. The flickering overhead lights barely illuminated the room, creating an atmosphere of eerie suspense. Then they heard it, a faint noise, the sound of something or someone moving in the distance. Martin signaled to Eva to stay low, and they crept forward. They were nearing the back of the warehouse when a sudden voice froze them in place. Well, what do we have here?" The voice was cool, mocking. It came from the shadows ahead, and Martin's blood ran cold. The figure stepped forward, and there she was, Olga Mikhailov. She was just as the manager had described, poised, confident, and unnervingly calm. Her icy blue eyes locked onto Martin's with a predatory gleam. "I was wondering when you two would show up," she said, her lips curling into a smile. "I didn't think it would be this soon, but I suppose I should have known." Martin's fingers tightened around his gun. "You killed Willem," he said, his voice steady but fierce. "You've been pulling the strings the entire time." Olga's smile didn't waver. "Oh, Willem was a necessary inconvenience. He was useful, but ultimately, I had to clean up the mess. And you two are just the latest problem I need to deal with." Eva stepped forward, her gun raised. "We're not leaving here without answers. Where's the accountant? And what's the deal with the weapons?" Olga's expression darkened for a split second before she regained her composure. "The accountant? He's of no concern to you anymore. As for the weapons, you're too late. Everything is already in motion." Before either Martin or Eva could react, Olga's hand shot out, pressing a button hidden on a nearby wall. The warehouse doors slammed shut with a deafening crash, trapping them inside. Martin cursed under his breath. "This isn't over." Olga's cold laughter echoed in the space between them. "No, it's just beginning. Let's jump to next story." Story 3. The autumn wind swept across the canals of Amsterdam, carrying with it the scent of damp leaves and the distant hum of the city's heartbeat. It was late in the evening when Detective Lars de Vries stood by the water's edge, his coat flapping in the breeze. He was lost in thought, staring at the ripples created by the boat motors passing by. But his mind wasn't on the serene surroundings. It was on the case that had consumed him for the past several weeks, a case that had grown darker and more twisted with each passing day. A series of mysterious robberies had struck the heart of Amsterdam's wealthy district. The targets were high-profile individuals, politicians, business tycoons, and celebrities, each with one thing in common. They were all involved in controversial dealings that could potentially bring down some of the most powerful figures in the country. The thieves were no ordinary criminals. They were meticulous, almost surgical in their approach. There were no signs of forced entry, no obvious clues left behind. And yet, each victim had lost something irreplaceable: documents, files, incriminating evidence of illegal deals. Lars had followed every lead, every trail of breadcrumbs, but each one seemed to disappear before he could grasp it. His frustration had only grown as he found himself circling the same questions over and over. Who was behind these robberies? And what were they after? His phone buzzed in his pocket, interrupting his thoughts. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was an encrypted message from an anonymous source, something he had grown accustomed to over the past few weeks. The message read simply, "Check the warehouse by the docks. It's all there." Without a moment's hesitation, Lars pocketed his phone and hailed a cab. The address in the message led him to a quiet, unassuming street near the industrial part of the city. The area was dotted with old warehouses that had been abandoned for years, left to decay in the shadows of the city's modern growth. But something about this place felt different. The dim streetlights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the pavement as Lars approached the warehouse. His hand hovered over his gun, the familiar weight of it grounding him as he stepped forward. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and he was immediately hit with the musty scent of old wood and metal. His flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the abandoned warehouse. The walls were covered in layers of grime, and dust hung in the air like a thick fog. But as his light scanned the room, his breath caught in his throat. There, scattered across the floor, were the items he had been searching for: files, documents, and photographs, all discarded like trash. Lars bent down to inspect the papers. As he sifted through them, the gravity of the situation hit him. These weren't just ordinary documents. These were confidential files, documents that could bring down some of the most powerful people in the country. It was clear now. Whoever was behind these robberies wasn't just after money or valuables, they were after power. Suddenly, the door to the warehouse slammed shut behind him, plunging the room into darkness. Lars whipped around, his heart racing as he fumbled for his flashlight. Before he could react, the sharp sound of footsteps echoed in the silence. He was not alone. A shadowy figure stepped out from the darkness, their face obscured by a black hood. The figure moved swiftly, circling Lars like a predator stalking its prey. Lars instinctively reached for his gun, but the figure was faster. In a blur of motion, they knocked the weapon from his hand, sending it skittering across the floor. Looking for something? The figure's voice was cold, smooth, and dripping with malice. Lars could barely make out the outline of the figure in the darkness, but he could feel the tension in the air. This wasn't just a thief. This was someone with a purpose, someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Lars straightened up, trying to maintain his composure. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. The figure chuckled darkly, the sound sending a shiver down Lars' spine. "That's not important," they replied. "What matters is that you've stumbled upon something you weren't supposed to see." Before Lars could react, the figure lunged at him, a sharp object in their hand. He barely managed to dodge the blow, the cold metal slicing through the air, just inches from his face. Lars quickly grabbed a nearby pipe and swung it at the attacker, forcing them back. The figure staggered, but they quickly recovered, launching themselves at him again. Lars fought back with everything he had, his instincts kicking in as he ducked and weaved, narrowly avoiding the figure's attacks. But as the struggle continued, Lars could feel his strength waning. The attacker was relentless, and he could tell they had done this before. Whoever they were trained, dangerous. The fight seemed to go on forever, the darkness of the warehouse closing in around them as they exchanged blows. But then, just as Lars thought he couldn't go on any longer, the figure suddenly stopped. They straightened up, their movements slow and deliberate, as if they had all the time in the world. Lars stood panting, his body aching from the fight. He was about to ask what the figure wanted when a soft chuckle escaped their lips. "You're in over your head, detective," the figure said, their voice dripping with amusement. "This isn't just a robbery. This is much bigger than you could ever imagine." Before Lars could respond, the figure turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving him alone in the dark, surrounded by the remnants of the conspiracy that had brought him here. The weight of the situation began to sink in. This was no ordinary criminal. This was someone with an agenda, someone who was willing to kill to keep their secrets safe. Lars knew then that the stakes had been raised. This wasn't just about catching a thief. It was about uncovering a web of corruption that reached to the highest levels of power in the Netherlands. And Lars had just scratched the surface. Lars stood in the silence of the warehouse, his breathing heavy as he tried to regain his bearings. The figure's words echoed in his mind, a warning he couldn't ignore. This is much bigger than you could ever imagine. What had he just uncovered? His mind raced, piecing together the fragments of the case that had, until now, felt disjointed and insignificant. The documents on the floor were no longer just the remnants of stolen goods. They were pieces of a larger puzzle, a puzzle that had eluded him for weeks. Lars bent down and began to collect the papers, his hands trembling slightly as he sifted through them. There were names he recognized, powerful figures in the government and business world, individuals he had always believed were beyond reproach. And then there were other names, strange, unfamiliar, but with connections that seemed to intertwine in ways he couldn't yet understand. He needed to get back to the precinct. He needed to analyze these documents, cross-reference them with his existing information, and make sense of the web that was slowly unfurling in front of him. But just as he was about to leave, something caught his eye, an old ledger tucked beneath a pile of scattered papers. It was bound in faded leather, its pages yellowed with age. Curious, Lars opened it, flipping through the pages with a growing sense of unease. The entries were meticulous, almost obsessive, but what stood out the most were the final few pages. The last entries were dated just a few days before the first robbery occurred. The handwriting was neat, but the content was chilling. It detailed meetings, secretive late-night meetings, and transactions between seemingly innocuous businesses. But when Lars looked closer, he saw the names of notorious arms dealers, political figures with questionable affiliations, and even a few international criminals who had long evaded capture. The ledger revealed an underground network operating in plain sight, and somehow, it was all connected to the high-profile robberies that had plagued Amsterdam. Lars snapped the ledger shut, a sense of dread creeping up his spine. This wasn't just about stolen goods. This was about a network that had been operating in the shadows, pulling the strings of power in the city. And now Lars had become part of the game, a game that had no rules, no boundaries, and no mercy. As he stood up, the sound of sirens wailing in the distance reminded him that he wasn't alone in this investigation. The city had already started to stir, unaware of the storm that was brewing beneath the surface. He needed to be careful. Every move he made from this point forward would be scrutinized, and there were powerful people, dangerous people, who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. Lars rushed out of the warehouse, his thoughts racing as he climbed into the waiting taxi. The journey back to the precinct felt like an eternity, the weight of the documents and the ledger pressing down on him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He had become a target, and he knew it. Back at the station, Lars spread the documents out on his desk, his eyes scanning over the details as he tried to make sense of it all. There were names, dates, and locations, but the connections were still unclear. He knew he needed help, expert help, but who could he trust? The higher-ups in the department had been hesitant to take the case seriously from the beginning, and there were whispers of corruption even within the police force. Lars had always prided himself on his integrity, but now, even his colleagues seemed like potential suspects. As the hours passed, Lars continued to pore over the files, his frustration mounting. The evidence was right in front of him, but it felt like he was missing something crucial, something that could tie everything together. His eyes fell on one of the names that had stood out to him earlier, Victor Hartmann, a well-known real estate mogul with ties to several high-ranking politicians. Hartmann had always been in the news for his charitable contributions and his involvement in various business ventures. But now, looking at the list of shady dealings in the ledger, Lars saw a pattern. Hartmann had been involved in several transactions with the same people linked to the robberies, and he had been in Amsterdam just before the first heist. Lars knew what he had to do next. He had to get to Hartmann, and he had to do it fast. The problem was, Hartmann was untouchable, too powerful, too influential. Lars had to tread carefully. Any wrong move, and he could find himself buried under a mountain of lies with no way out. He stood up, grabbing his coat, and heading for the door. He didn't have a plan, not a solid one anyway, but he knew one thing for sure: time was running out. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and he was about to uncover something far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. As he stepped outside into the cool night air, the city felt different, darker, more oppressive. It was as if the walls were closing in on him, and every corner he turned held another secret, another lie. Lars had always thought of Amsterdam as a city of beauty, a place where people could escape from the troubles of the world. But now he saw it for what it really was, a city built on secrets, corruption, and deceit. And in the heart of it all was Victor Hartmann, a man who had far more to lose than anyone could ever imagine. Lars' phone buzzed in his pocket, interrupting his thoughts. It was a message from an unknown number. "I know what you're looking for, detective, and I can help you if you're willing to listen." The message sent a chill down his spine. He wasn't sure who this person was, but one thing was clear: someone else knew too much. Someone who might just have the answers he desperately needed. But in a city like Amsterdam, trust was a rare commodity, and Lars knew better than anyone that not everyone who offered help could be trusted. The game had changed, and Lars de Vries was now playing for his life. Let's jump to next story. Story 4. It was a cold, misty night in Amsterdam, and the streets seemed deserted. save for the occasional distant sound of a car or the rustling of an unnoticed breeze through the alleyways. Detective Willem de Vries stood at the entrance of a dilapidated warehouse, his breath visible in the chilled air. His usually calm demeanor had been replaced with a sense of urgency and unease. He had been chasing this case for weeks, the most perplexing and dangerous he had encountered in his decade-long career in the Dutch police force. He had seen his fair share of robberies, burglaries, and petty crimes, but this was different. The silence surrounding the robbery spree was what unnerved him the most. No one seemed to know anything. The criminal mastermind was always one step ahead. The latest heist had occurred the previous night, a meticulously planned robbery that had left the authorities bewildered. The target? A high-end jewelry store in the heart of Amsterdam's luxury district. But there was something peculiar about this crime. No signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, nothing to give a hint of the perpetrator's identity. The entire scene was eerily clean, as though the thief had vanished into thin air. Willem had arrived at the warehouse on a tip-off. A source, anonymous and cryptic, had claimed that the answer to the city's string of robberies lay hidden in this very building. His gut told him that the source was genuine. He was, after all, no stranger to informants with fragmented pieces of truth, but this one had an edge to it, a certain weight that made it different from the usual tips he received. So here he was, standing in front of a decrepit structure in a desolate corner of the city, unsure of what he might find inside. Taking a deep breath, Willem pulled his coat tighter around his body and approached the entrance. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and the faint smell of mold and stale air hit him immediately. Inside, the darkness was overwhelming, but Willem had grown accustomed to such environments. His flashlight illuminated the space, casting long shadows along the walls as he cautiously stepped deeper into the building. The warehouse had been abandoned for years, yet it was clear someone had been here recently. Empty boxes, discarded tools, and strange markings on the floor pointed to activity. Willem's eyes scanned the room, his instincts kicking in. There had to be something, anything, that could link the location to the robberies. As he moved further into the room, a glint of light caught his attention, and he moved toward it. It was a small piece of jewelry, a necklace, shining faintly under the dim light. It was a gold pendant with a delicate diamond set at its center. Willem's pulse quickened as he recognized the design. This was the signature of the jewelry store that had been robbed just hours ago. His mind raced. How had it ended up here? Who had left it behind, and why? He picked it up carefully, inspecting it for any markings that might help him trace it. But there was nothing, just the shine of the diamond and the heavy weight of the questions pressing down on him. As he stood there, turning the pendant over in his hand, the sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse. Willem's heart skipped a beat, and his hand instinctively reached for the gun holstered at his side. He was not alone. Slowly he turned around, his flashlight casting light over the shadows, and there, standing in the doorway, was a figure. A tall man, dressed in a black trench coat, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. The stranger said nothing for a moment, studying Willem as if calculating whether or not the detective had spotted something he wasn't meant to see. Willem's hand tightened around the gun, his grip steady. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice firm. The stranger didn't answer immediately, but took a few slow steps forward, the silence hanging between them like a thick fog. Then, with a calmness that betrayed the tension in the air, he spoke. "Looking for answers, detective? You're in the wrong place," the man said, his voice smooth, yet carrying an underlying threat. "You think this is a random heist? You think you've got it all figured out? You're far from the truth, Willem." Willem's eyes narrowed as the man's words sunk in. "What do you know about the robberies?" he asked, not lowering his weapon. The stranger smirked, his expression unreadable. "I know more than you can imagine," the man said, taking another step closer. "I know who's behind it all, and I know why they're doing it." Willem's mind raced. This was no ordinary criminal. The confidence in his voice, the knowledge he possessed, it was as if the man knew everything, every move Willem had made up until now. Something wasn't right, and as the man took yet another step forward, Willem could sense that he was being led down a path, one that he wasn't sure he was prepared to follow. "Why don't you put the gun down, detective?" the man continued. "It's not going to help you. Trust me, you'll need all your wits to stay one step ahead." A chill ran down Willem's spine. The man was no longer just a suspect in the case. He was something far more dangerous. Willem had been in the business long enough to know when he was out of his depth, and right now, he felt like he was standing on the edge of something much larger than a simple robbery ring. The silence stretched between them, the tension palpable. Willem's mind spun as he weighed his options. He couldn't afford to make a mistake, not now. But his instincts told him that the answers he was looking for were closer than ever. The man in front of him was key to unraveling the mystery. Whether he wanted to admit it or not, Willem had just crossed into unknown territory. "I don't have time for games," Willem said, his voice cold, as he stepped back slightly, keeping his eyes fixed on the stranger. "Oh, this is no game," the man replied, his smirk widening. "But you're playing in a league far beyond your comprehension, detective. So good luck. You'll need it." With that, the man turned and vanished into the darkness, leaving Willem standing alone in the warehouse, the faint glow of the pendant still in his hand. The streets of Amsterdam had grown colder as the evening fog rolled in. The city's winding canals shimmered beneath the fading glow of streetlights, and the hum of the night echoed off the cobblestone streets. In the shadow of the Rijksmuseum, a black car sat idle in the darkness, its engine purring softly. Inside, the tension was palpable. The driver, a man with a sharp jawline and an even sharper mind, stared ahead, his knuckles white as they gripped the steering wheel. His name was Victor, and his past was as murky as the water running beneath the bridges of this ancient city. Victor had been a part of this criminal underworld for years. He wasn't a boss, nor was he a small-time thug. He was a man in the middle, someone who knew the ins and outs, the unwritten rules of the game. But tonight was different. Tonight, he was about to make a deal, one that would either cement his place in the syndicate or lead to his downfall. Across the street from Victor's parked car stood a modest coffee shop, the kind that blended effortlessly into the bustling urban landscape. But to Victor, it was no ordinary cafe. It was a front for something far more sinister. The shop was owned by a man named Lars, a man with connections that stretched across Europe, from the rough streets of Berlin to the quiet hills of Switzerland. And tonight, Lars had promised Victor the kind of deal that could change his life. "Come on, Victor. It's time," a voice crackled through the earpiece. It was Johan, Victor's right-hand man, a loyal companion, but one who had always been wary of this particular deal. "Are you sure about this?" Victor didn't respond immediately. He simply stared out the window, watching as people passed by, oblivious to the business unfolding just a few feet away. "I have to do this," he muttered under his breath. "We don't get another shot at this." With a steady breath, Victor exited the car, his coat flaring slightly as the wind caught it. He adjusted his collar, and with deliberate steps, he walked toward the coffee shop. As he approached, the door opened with a soft chime, and he entered the dimly lit interior. Lars was already seated at a small table in the back, sipping from a cup of espresso. His sharp eyes followed Victor as he walked in, his lips curling into a faint smile. The two men exchanged a brief nod before Victor took a seat across from Lars. "You've come alone, I see," Lars remarked, his voice smooth as silk. "That's good. It shows you're serious about this." Victor didn't respond immediately. He simply glanced around the room, ensuring that no one was watching too closely. His instincts were honed, but even in a place like this, you couldn't be too careful. "I'm here for what we talked about," Victor said, his tone low but firm. "The payment, the weapons, and the protection for my men." Lars leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the side of his coffee cup. "Ah yes, the terms. I've got your weapons. High-grade stuff, enough firepower to wipe out a small army. But the protection, that's the tricky part, isn't it?" Victor raised an eyebrow, his hand resting near the holstered gun beneath his jacket. "Don't tell me you're backing out now." Lars chuckled softly, the sound almost too casual for Victor's taste. "Oh, I'm not backing out, but the protection I promised you doesn't come cheap. You want safe passage for your men, you want them to stay alive, then you're going to have to pay the price." The air between them thickened. Victor's gaze hardened. "I didn't come here to negotiate. You agreed to the deal." "I agreed to the deal, yes. But circumstances have changed." Lars leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You see, there are people who are interested in your little operation, Victor. People who don't care much for you or your syndicate. If you want to avoid a little complication, you'll need to make a choice. You either pay the price, or you take your chances." Victor clenched his jaw. He had suspected something like this would happen, but that didn't make it any easier. In this business, betrayal was as common as rain in Amsterdam. "I'll pay," Victor said after a tense silence. "But I want the weapons now. No more games." Lars smiled, the expression cold and calculated. "As you wish." With a swift motion, Lars gestured to the back of the shop, and a door on the far wall opened. A man in a black suit stepped through, carrying a heavy duffel bag. Without a word, he placed it on the table, and Victor's eyes flickered to it. Inside, the gleam of high-end firearms caught the light, just as promised. Victor's fingers twitched, but he held back. He could take the bag and leave, but the sense of unease lingered. Lars was playing a game here, and Victor wasn't sure if he was the player or the pawn. "Pleasure doing business," Lars said, rising from his chair. "Just remember, Victor, the price for protection is never fixed. Keep that in mind." Victor stood up, his mind racing. He grabbed the duffel bag, nodding curtly to Lars. "I'll remember." As he turned to leave, a sense of foreboding filled his chest. The deal had been made, but the cost, both in terms of money and loyalty, remained uncertain. And in the world Victor inhabited, uncertainty could be deadly. Let's jump to next story. Story 5. The streets of Rotterdam echoed with the distant sounds of honking horns and the shuffle of hurried footsteps. The fog that hung thick over the harbor made the bustling city appear as if it were in a dream, where the boundary between reality and illusion was blurry. In this city of innovation and industry, secrets were traded just as easily as goods, and none were more valuable than the ones kept hidden in the shadows. Martin Veldman, a man with a past as dark as the water beneath the city's bridges, leaned against the edge of a derelict building, his eyes scanning the street. The air was damp and biting, but he paid no attention. His focus was on the task at hand, one that had taken him years to set in motion. He had learned the hard way that, in the world of crime, patience was more than a virtue, it was a necessity. Veldman had spent most of his life moving through the underbelly of Europe, trafficking in stolen goods, smuggling rare art, and dealing in illegal weapons. He wasn't a mastermind, not like the old bosses who ruled with iron fists. But he was cunning, and he had built a reputation as someone who could get things done without leaving a trace. It was a reputation that served him well, but it had also earned him a dangerous set of enemies. The job he had taken on today wasn't one he would normally consider, but the stakes were higher than ever. This time, it wasn't about stolen artwork or rare antiques. It was about something far more valuable: information. Information that could topple governments, ruin corporations, and change the course of history. Information that was locked inside a vault in a building just down the street. Veldman had been hired by a shadowy figure known only as the broker. The broker had offered him a sum of money so large that it had been impossible to resist. But the job was dangerous, too dangerous for most, and that was why it had been handed to Veldman. He was no stranger to risk, and this one would push him to the edge. He straightened up, his leather jacket creaking as he moved. It was time. The plan had been set in motion weeks ago, and everything was in place. The building he was heading toward was one of the most secure in the city, a fortress with multiple layers of security, surveillance cameras, and armed guards at every entrance. But none of that fazed Veldman. He had a way of getting around things like that. He stepped out into the street, his boots clicking on the cobblestones as he made his way toward the building. His mind was calm, his thoughts focused, but beneath that calm exterior, his heart was pounding. He wasn't afraid. He hadn't been afraid in years. But there was something different about this job. It wasn't just the money. It was the sense that he was about to cross a line, one that could not be undone. As he approached the entrance, a man in a dark suit stepped forward, blocking his path. The man's face was expressionless, but Veldman could see the tension in his posture. He had been expecting this. "Password?" the man asked, his voice cold. Veldman didn't hesitate. "Redemption." The man nodded, stepping aside to allow him through. Veldman's eyes darted to the security cameras above, but he knew they were already compromised. His team had taken care of that earlier in the day. With a single glance, he scanned the area for any other signs of danger. There was none. Not yet, anyway. Inside, the building was quiet, the hum of the air conditioning the only sound. He walked down a long, narrow hallway, the walls lined with sleek metal doors. Each one was locked, each one guarding something important. But none of them were his concern. Not tonight. At the end of the hallway, a door stood slightly ajar, and the soft glow of a lamp leaked out from the crack. He approached it silently, his steps measured. As he reached the door, he paused for a moment, listening. He could hear the sound of voices on the other side, low murmuring. He knew who was in there. They were the key players in this entire operation, the ones who had the information he needed. Veldman's heart rate quickened as he slowly pushed the door open, just enough to slip inside. The room was dimly lit, but he could make out the figures of 3 men sitting around a table, their faces obscured by shadows. One of them, a man with a scar running down his face, looked up as the door creaked open. "You're late," the the scarred man said, his voice gruff. I'm here now, Veldman replied evenly, his eyes scanning the room. He didn't trust these men, not for a second. But he didn't need to. All he needed was the information in that file, and then he was gone. The scarred man motioned to the table. It's all here, he said, his tone cold. Everything you need to know. But don't think for a second that you can just walk out of here with it. Veldman gave a short nod, stepping forward and retrieving the file from the table. The paper was thick, the weight of it somehow making it feel more important than it actually was. But Veldman didn't have time to dwell on it. The clock was ticking, and he had one last obstacle to clear before he could escape. As he turned to leave, he felt the cold barrel of a gun pressed against his back. Not so fast, the scarred man growled. The cold metal of the gun pressed harder into his back, and Veldman could feel the tension in the air shift. The room, which had once felt calm and almost methodical, now felt claustrophobic, like the walls were closing in. His mind raced as he processed the situation. He had expected something to go wrong, but he hadn't expected this. He had done everything by the book. He had the password, the file, the access. Everything was set up perfectly. So why was he being held at gunpoint now? For a brief moment, Veldman considered making a move. The scarred man's hand was firm on the gun, but there was a hesitation in his grip. That was all Veldman needed, a single split-second opening. He knew the risks. A confrontation in this space would be messy, but not impossible. Still, he played the long game. Patience was the key to everything, especially in this business. You think you can just waltz in here, take the goods, and walk out? The scarred man spat, his voice laced with bitterness. Do you really believe it's that easy? Veldman didn't respond. He didn't need to. He had been in worse situations before, situations where talk only made things worse. A slow exhale, his hand resting by his side, was all he gave. The scarred man must have seen the calm in Veldman's eyes because the grip on the gun loosened just slightly. Another man, younger and much less hardened by the life they led, stood up from the table. You're making a mistake, Victor, the younger man said, his voice almost pleading. He had the look of someone who had been dragged into something far deeper than he had intended. We can still make a deal. We don't need to do this. Victor, the scarred man, snarled, his gaze flicking toward the younger man before turning back to Veldman. No deals, he growled. He took the file. He knew the risks. Veldman's mind worked quickly. Victor wasn't the mastermind behind this operation. He was just a goon, a thug. But the other two in the room, they were something else, smarter, more calculating. One of them had to be calling the shots. If he could manipulate the situation, turn it into his advantage, there was still a way out. I know what I'm doing, Veldman said quietly, his eyes narrowing. But you're not in charge here, Victor. The room fell silent, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Victor looked at Veldman like he had just spoken a foreign language, unable to comprehend what he was hearing. But it was the truth. There were bigger players involved. People who wouldn't hesitate to make a deal with someone like Veldman if it served their interests. Victor was a small piece in the puzzle. The others? They were the ones pulling the strings. Veldman's gaze shifted to the younger man, who was now eyeing him warily. There was hesitation in his eyes, a flicker of doubt. The fear of getting caught in the crossfire was evident. Veldman locked eyes with him, a silent understanding passing between them. The young man might have been out of his depth, but he wasn't completely loyal to Victor and his partners. That was Veldman's key. With a sudden movement, Veldman dropped to the floor, just as Victor's grip on the gun tightened once more. A shot rang out, but it missed by a wide margin. In the blink of an eye, Veldman was on his feet, grabbing the man closest to him and using him as a shield. The room erupted into chaos. Shots rang out, loud and deafening, and Veldman's heart raced, adrenaline surging through his veins. He had no time to think, only to react. He pushed forward, knocking the young man aside and diving toward the table. The file he had come for, his ticket out of this mess, was within arm's reach. His hand grasped it just as another bullet whizzed past him, embedding itself into the wall with a loud crack. Veldman didn't hesitate. He bolted toward the door, using the distraction he had created to his advantage. His lungs burned, his muscles ached, but he couldn't stop. The file was in his hand, and nothing was going to stop him now. He didn't look back as he tore through the hallway, not waiting for the inevitable pursuit. Victor and his men were still recovering, disoriented by the chaos that had ensued. Veldman could hear footsteps behind him, but they were slow, unsure. Victor was a thug, not a tactician, and he would need time to gather his wits. The door at the end of the hallway was just a few meters away now. Veldman's eyes locked on it, his focus absolute. He was so close to freedom, so close to the prize that had cost him everything. With one final push, he shoved the door open and stepped into the alleyway outside. The cold night air hit him like a slap in the face, but it was a welcome change from the stifling tension inside. He could hear sirens in the distance, a sign that his time was running out. The streets of Rotterdam were alive, but now they were his cover. He disappeared into the crowd, blending in with the chaos of the city. For a moment, he allowed himself to breathe. He had done it. He had walked into the lion's den, grabbed what he needed, and walked away. But he knew it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The file in his hand held the kind of power that could destroy lives. And there were many who would come after him for it. But for now, Veldman had won. And in the world he lived in, that was enough. Let's jump to next story. Story 6. The narrow streets of Amsterdam's old district were shrouded in mist, the cool breeze carrying the scent of rain that had just passed. It was early in the evening, the kind of time when the city seemed caught between the twilight of day and the darkness of night, and that uncertainty was what made it perfect for deals like the one Victor had planned. He was no stranger to the world of shadows. His life had been carved by the choices that others didn't dare make, and by the secrets they hid behind locked doors and whispered conversations. Victor was a man who had come to understand the rules of power in ways most people could never fathom. He had risen from the bottom, had taken advantage of those who were foolish enough to think they could outwit him. And now, as the final stages of his operation unfolded, he knew that tonight would be the culmination of years of work, a night that would either bring him unimaginable power or destroy him entirely. He walked briskly through the damp alley, his boots echoing off the cobblestones. His coat flapped against his legs, the dark fabric blending seamlessly into the surrounding shadows. He kept his eyes trained ahead, his mind focused on the task at hand. He had to meet his contact, an elusive figure known only as the broker. The broker had the kind of information that could change everything, the kind of information Victor had been searching for, and he knew that tonight would be the moment when his fate was sealed. Victor had never met the broker in person. Their communication had always been through encrypted messages and carefully arranged meetings in obscure locations. But tonight, Victor had no choice but to face him directly. The broker's terms were clear. No one would know who he was, not even the people Victor trusted most. And so, as Victor neared the address he had been given, his thoughts turned to the risks that were involved. Was he making the right choice? The weight of the decision hung over him like a dark cloud. If the broker's information was accurate, it could change the course of Victor's plans. And that was exactly why he couldn't afford to let this slip away. He had spent too long building his empire to turn back now. But even Victor couldn't escape the nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach, a feeling that warned him of the dangers ahead. He reached the old building, its stone walls worn with age, the dark windows reflecting the dim light from the street lamps. It was an inconspicuous place, the kind of building no one would think twice about. That was the point. In this city, where every corner held a secret, blending in was the key to survival. Victor glanced around before entering, making sure no one was watching, before he pushed open the creaky door and stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit, the air heavy with the scent of dust and something metallic. It smelled like history, like secrets that had been buried for years, and Victor felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise as he moved deeper into the building. He had to find the broker before anyone else did. The room was sparse, with a few chairs scattered about, a small table in the center, and a solitary figure standing near the far wall. The figure didn't move as Victor entered, but Victor knew he had been expected. The broker was exactly as he had imagined, calm, composed, and always a step ahead. "You're late," the figure said, his voice low and almost melodic. Victor didn't flinch. "Traffic," he said curtly, the lie rolling off his tongue effortlessly. "Let's get down to business." The broker didn't respond immediately, but Victor could see his eyes glinting from beneath the shadow of his hood. The broker had the look of someone who had lived through countless deals, someone who understood the value of power, but also the cost it demanded. He was a man who dealt in information, but he also dealt in trust, and trust was something Victor had learned to give only sparingly. "You want what I have, but you don't trust me," the broker said, finally stepping forward, his voice taking on a more conversational tone. "You're right not to. Trust is a currency that's more valuable than gold. But tonight, you'll have to buy it, Victor." Victor's jaw tightened. "How much?" The broker smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "It's not about money. You want power, but power isn't free. There's always a price." Victor met his gaze, holding it steadily. I'm not here to play games. No one ever is, the broker replied. But if you want what's behind this door, he gestured toward a small, inconspicuous door at the back of the room, you'll have to accept the conditions. Victor felt the hairs on the back of his neck prickle. He had known the risks of dealing with someone like the broker, but the temptation of what lay beyond that door, the information, the leverage, was too much to resist. He needed it. What's behind it? Victor asked, his voice low but sharp. The broker didn't answer directly. Instead, he gestured for Victor to follow. As they walked toward the door, Victor couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into something far deeper than he had anticipated. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room. Inside, there was a table covered in files and documents. And at the center of the table was a small, unmarked box. This is the key to everything, the broker said, his voice barely above a whisper. But remember, once you take it, you're in. There's no going back. Victor took a step forward, his eyes locked on the box. He didn't hesitate. He reached out, lifting the lid. Inside was a small, sealed envelope. It was the kind of envelope that could change lives, information that could topple governments, ruin careers, or build new empires. Victor knew that once he opened it, his world would never be the same. Victor stood frozen, the envelope in his hands heavier than it appeared. His fingers hovered over the seal, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He knew this was it, the pivotal choice. The broker was watching him closely, but there was something detached in his gaze, as if he had seen this all before. For Victor, this was the culmination of years of strategy, manipulation, and countless calculated risks. Opening that envelope would confirm his fate, success or failure, victory or downfall. Go ahead, the broker urged quietly, his tone almost nonchalant. You've come this far. Don't hesitate now. Victor didn't speak, his mind racing as his thumb carefully peeled the seal. Every second felt like an eternity, the silence stretching between them. The stillness in the room was suffocating. There was a chance that the information inside could make him untouchable, a king in the criminal underworld, a man with power that even the highest authorities would fear. But there was also a chance that it could destroy him. He had no illusions about the stakes. Victor had dealt with dangerous men before, people who thought they could control him. But in the end, it was always the people who held the information that had the power. The broker had promised him a key to control, to leverage. And for Victor, control was the most valuable thing of all. With a swift motion, Victor ripped open the envelope. His pulse quickened as he unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. It was filled with names, politicians, businessmen, high-ranking police officers, and criminals. But what caught Victor's eye was a photograph tucked into the corner of the page. It was grainy, black and white, showing a man Victor recognized immediately. His heart skipped a beat. The photo showed the head of a powerful criminal syndicate, a man named Mikhail Ivanov. Ivanov had built an empire that spanned continents, a shadowy figure who remained out of reach for the longest time. For years, Victor had tried to find a way to get close to Ivanov, to break into his circle. Ivanov's network was impenetrable, his loyalty to his inner circle unshakable. But now, Victor had the one thing he needed to bring Ivanov down, a weakness. The document didn't just contain names and contacts. It listed connections, corrupt dealings, and more importantly, evidence. There were dates, locations, and coded messages that pointed to several illegal operations Ivanov was involved in. But the real kicker was the final sentence. Mikhail Ivanov's secret weapon is hidden in Amsterdam. This is your leverage. Use it wisely. Victor's mind raced. He had just been handed the key to one of the most powerful syndicates in the world, and all he had to do was use the leverage to break it. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized the complexity of what was in front of him. Ivanov wasn't just some low-level criminal. It was a global operation, and any move Victor made would have consequences. The bigger the risk, the bigger the reward. The broker watched Victor's expression closely, waiting for his reaction. Victor looked back up, his face betraying nothing. He folded the paper carefully and placed it back into the envelope. This is... Victor trailed off, trying to find the right words. You've given me more than I expected. The broker simply nodded, as if he had already anticipated Victor's thoughts. It's all in your hands now. But remember, Victor, power doesn't come without its price. Use this wisely, or it will consume you. Victor felt the weight of the broker's words. Power was intoxicating, but it could also destroy the unprepared. He knew that what lay ahead wasn't just a business transaction. It was a game of survival. He was stepping into a war that spanned continents, and the stakes were higher than ever before. For a moment, Victor considered his options. He had what he needed. He could go after Ivanov and bring him down, but the risk was monumental. Ivanov had eyes everywhere, trusted allies, corrupt law enforcement, and a ruthless network that would stop at nothing to protect their leader. Every move Victor made would have to be calculated, precise, and swift. Any misstep could lead to his downfall, but there was no turning back now. Victor had crossed the point of no return. The broker had given him the leverage he needed, but the game was far from over. It was a dangerous game, one that only the boldest could play, and Victor knew that he was one of them. "I'll take the risk," Victor finally said, his voice steady. "I'm not backing down." The broker gave a small, knowing smile. "That's what I wanted to hear." Victor turned toward the door, his mind already racing with plans, contingencies, and ways to get ahead of Ivanov. The world outside was waiting, and it was a world that he would soon conquer. But as he stepped out of the room, Victor couldn't shake the feeling that in this game of power and betrayal, the real danger wasn't from Ivanov or the authorities. It was from the one who had just handed him the keys to the kingdom. The broker's smile lingered in Victor's mind as he walked back into the cool night air. It was a reminder that in the underworld, no one could ever be trusted completely. The broker had given him a weapon, but Victor knew better than to think he was the only one with a hand on the trigger. As he disappeared into the shadows of the Amsterdam streets, Victor understood that his journey had just begun. Every choice from this point forward would shape the future. And as much as he craved power, Victor had learned one thing from the darkness that had always surrounded him. In the end, power was a dangerous thing, and those who sought it often found themselves ensnared by it. Let's jump to next story. Story 7. It was a cold night in Amsterdam, the air biting with the sharpness of impending rain. The narrow streets were slick from the earlier drizzle, their reflective sheen catching the dim glow of the streetlights. Muffled footsteps echoed as Viktor Karpov moved swiftly through the deserted alleyways, his breath visible in the chill of the night. The city had a way of hiding its secrets, but Victor had spent years learning how to find them. Tonight was no different. He was after something big, something that could elevate him beyond the murky depths of the criminal world and into the ranks of the elite. For years, Victor had navigated the labyrinth of Amsterdam's underground, gaining influence and power, but tonight was different. The Dutch underworld was fractured, and the vacuum left by the fall of several key players had left the city ripe for the taking. Victor had long been a man with ambition, but this time he had something more, a connection that could give him control of the largest drug trafficking ring in Europe. It wasn't just about power anymore, it was about securing his place at the top. His destination was an unassuming warehouse near the harbor, a place where deals were made in silence and shadows. It had been carefully chosen, out of the public eye, yet close enough to the city's core to be valuable. Victor's contacts had given him the information he needed. A shipment of rare, high-purity cocaine was set to arrive tonight, and it was his chance to take control. The deal had been set up by a notorious Dutch kingpin named Ridge Dekker, a man known for his ruthlessness and connections in high places. Victor had always admired Dekker's ability to operate under the radar, but he had no illusions about how far Dekker would go to protect his empire. The wind howled as Victor reached the warehouse's entrance, his hand brushing against the cold metal of the door. He glanced around cautiously before slipping inside. The air smelled of salt water and diesel, the faint hum of the harbor's machinery mixing with the rhythm of his own heartbeat. The place was empty, save for a few shadows that lingered in the corners of his mind. Victor had been in situations like this before, quiet, tense moments before the storm. He moved deeper into the warehouse, his senses alert to every sound, every movement. There was something unsettling about this particular deal, something that didn't sit right. He had been promised safe passage, a smooth transaction with no interference. But as Victor's eyes scanned the dimly lit space, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He reached the center of the warehouse where a large, unmarked truck sat idling, its engine purring softly. A couple of figures were unloading crates from the back. Victor's eyes narrowed as he observed them. They weren't the usual men he dealt with. Their faces were unfamiliar, their postures tense. Something was wrong. He approached cautiously, his hand instinctively resting on the gun holstered at his side. The air around him felt thicker now, charged with an unfamiliar tension. "Everything's set." Victor's voice was low, but sharp. One of the men turned, and Victor immediately recognized the look in his eyes. The fear of someone who knew they were in over their head. The man nodded quickly. Yes, everything's here, the man said, his voice shaky. We've got the goods. Victor stepped forward, his gaze now fixed on the crates. He had seen the markings before, a symbol associated with Decker's operation. This was it. The shipment was real. But as Victor took another step closer, his mind raced. There was something about the situation that didn't feel right. His instincts were usually spot on, and they were telling him to turn back. Where's Decker? Victor asked, his voice cold. The man hesitated, looking between Victor and the other figure by the truck. He sent us instead. Victor felt a jolt of unease shoot through him. Decker had never sent lackeys to handle the deal. He always handled things himself, or sent his most trusted men. This was a red flag. Victor's grip on his gun tightened. Where is he? Victor repeated, this time with more authority. The man swallowed hard, glancing toward the shadows in the back of the warehouse. He's inside, waiting for you. Victor nodded curtly and began to walk toward the back of the warehouse, his footsteps echoing loudly in the otherwise quiet space. The sense of unease was growing stronger. His hand was still on his gun, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. He didn't trust this. Nothing about this deal seemed like it was going to go smoothly. As he turned the corner, his eyes fell on the figure standing by a small desk. It was Ridge Decker, only it wasn't the Decker Victor had expected. The man before him was pale, his face drawn with exhaustion. He had the look of a man who had been caught off guard, unprepared, and perhaps already defeated. Victor, Decker said softly, his voice a far cry from the confident tone Victor had heard in the past. I was hoping we could talk. Victor's eyes narrowed. Something was terribly wrong. He stepped forward, his gaze scanning the room, taking in the shadows, the disarray of crates scattered on the floor, the faint scent of something burning in the distance. This wasn't a meeting, this was an ambush. Before Victor could react, the sound of a gunshot rang through the warehouse, followed by another and another. The air was thick with chaos as Victor dropped to the ground, instinctively reaching for his gun. The gunfire continued, each shot echoing through the vast empty space, and the reality of the situation hit him. This wasn't just a betrayal, it was a massacre in the making. Victor's mind raced as he hit the ground, his heart hammering in his chest. The loud cracks of gunfire were disorienting, but his training kicked in almost immediately. He rolled behind a stack of crates, the sound of bullets ripping through the air around him, sending a chill down his spine. The scent of gunpowder and the musty air of the warehouse mixed with the sound of his heartbeat, each thud making him more aware of the danger closing in. He could hear footsteps moving swiftly toward him, the unmistakable sound of someone with a purpose. Victor's eyes darted to the shadows as he tried to catch his breath, his hands still gripping his gun. His mind churned. Who would dare to double-cross him like this? He had always been careful, always one step ahead of his enemies. This was supposed to be a simple job, but now it was a fight for survival. The realization that Decker had betrayed him stung. Victor had trusted him, and now Decker was dead, or at least it seemed that way. The pallor of his face had been enough of a warning. The gunshots hadn't been meant to miss. Victor's grip tightened on his weapon. He peeked around the corner of the crate, his eyes scanning for any movement. The gunfire had stopped, but the tension in the air was palpable. Whoever was behind this was still close, and Victor had no intention of going down without a fight. He waited, listening for the faintest sound, calculating his next move. His gaze flicked over to the shadows again, and that's when he saw him. One of Decker's men, emerging cautiously from behind another stack of crates. The man was armed, his hand trembling as he aimed the gun. He hadn't seen Victor yet, but that wouldn't last long. Victor had seconds, maybe less. With a swift motion, Victor sprang from his hiding place, firing twice in quick succession. The first bullet hit its mark, straight through the man's shoulder, sending him to the floor with a muffled scream. The second shot missed, but it didn't matter. The man was already down, struggling to crawl toward cover. Victor didn't wait to see if the man survived. He darted toward the shadows at the back of the warehouse, every step calculated. His eyes were glued to the entrance, his senses on high alert. The enemy was still out there, and he could feel the shift in the atmosphere. This wasn't just a betrayal, it was a setup. They had been waiting for him. They knew he would come. He reached the far corner of the warehouse, ducking behind a metal column. He could hear voices now muffled, but clearly discussing something, probably their next move. Victor's eyes scanned the floor, searching for any advantage. There, lying among the scattered crates, was a toolbox. It wasn't much, but it was something. Victor grabbed it quickly, pulling out a crowbar. It wasn't ideal, but it would do the job. At least he'd be able to make a few more moves before they had the chance to corner him. Minutes passed like hours, and the only sounds Victor could hear were the faint echoes of his breathing and the distant hum of the harbor. He knew he couldn't stay hidden forever. He needed to act, and fast. He was outnumbered, but the element of surprise was still on his side. The voices grew louder as they approached his position. He could hear them arguing, likely about how to deal with him. Victor wasn't interested in their plans. He was focused on one thing, getting out alive. Suddenly, a figure appeared from the darkness, gun raised. Victor acted instinctively, ducking and rolling to the side, narrowly avoiding the first shot. His own gun was already in his hand, and without thinking, he fired twice. The first shot hit the man in the chest, dropping him instantly. The second shot grazed another man who had come into view, sending him stumbling back in pain. The noise of the gunfight echoed through the warehouse, and Victor's heart pounded. He had no time to savor the victory. He knew that more would come. His fingers brushed the cold metal of the crowbar, and with a grunt, he hurled it toward the shadows. It was a distraction, just enough time for him to move to the next corner, taking cover behind another stack of crates. For a moment, the warehouse fell silent again. Victor's mind raced, formulating his next move. He couldn't leave until he knew who had orchestrated this. Decker's betrayal was only part of the puzzle. Who else was involved, and what was their endgame? Then, a new sound reached his ears, a soft scraping of shoes on the concrete floor, followed by the slow but deliberate sound of someone walking toward him. Victor tensed, his body ready for another confrontation. But then a voice, a familiar voice, cut through the silence. "Victor, stop," the voice said, a hint of pleading in it. "You don't have to do this." Victor's heart skipped a beat. He recognized the voice instantly. It was Lena, his former associate, someone he had trusted more than most. She had been with him through thick and thin, and now here she was in the middle of this chaos, trying to stop him. "Lena, get out of here," Victor snapped, his voice sharp. "It's too dangerous." But Lena didn't move. Instead, she stepped out into the open, her hands raised slightly. "I didn't want this to happen. I swear to you, Victor. Decker's dead. And the rest of them, they're not going to stop." Victor's mind raced. He knew he couldn't trust anyone right now, but there was something in her voice, a desperation, a fear that mirrored his own. Could she be telling the truth? Or was she playing a dangerous game of her own? Let's jump to next story. Story 8. The rain drizzled in soft sheets over the canals of Amsterdam, casting a gray haze across the cobblestone streets and dampening the neon signs that flickered uncertainly above shuttered cafes. It was November of 2010, and the cold seemed sharper than usual, cutting through coats and settling in the bones. Inspector Elias Vermeer stood beneath the overhang of a tram stop near De Wallen, staring down at the plastic evidence bag in his hand. Inside was a single copper key, rusted and unremarkable, except for the dried blood crusted along its edges. It had been found clutched in the hand of a local journalist, Marta de Vries, whose body was discovered earlier that morning floating near a dock behind a canal house. Her throat had been slit with the precision of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. No witnesses, no signs of forced entry, no stolen belongings, just the key, and her blood-soaked notebook hidden in a waterproof pouch in her satchel. Elias had been on the force for nearly 20 years. He had seen overdoses, gang executions, domestic horrors. He had seen the quiet, creeping corruption that dug into Amsterdam's underbelly like rot in a foundation. But Marta's murder unsettled him in a way few cases had. She wasn't just any journalist. She was known for her obsessive investigations into institutional crime, real estate laundering, political blackmail, and the suspected reemergence of a syndicate believed to have gone underground in the mid-1990s. The last article she published, 2 days before her death, had hinted at a scandal involving a recently re-elected alderman and the reallocation of public housing funds into phantom construction companies. It hadn't named names, but the implications were heavy. Powerful enemies had clearly taken notice. He sighed, rubbing his temple. Marta had reached out to him last week, insisting they meet in private. He dismissed her then, assuming it was another one of her crusades against the city council. Now, with the image of her lifeless body flashing in his mind, guilt gnawed at him. He should have listened. The key had to mean something, and the notebook, even half destroyed by the canal water, was dense with shorthand, street names, and cryptic symbols. At first glance, it looked like nonsense. But Elias knew better. He had seen code before. She had been hiding her leads in plain sight. Back at the station, Elias placed the notebook under a heat lamp and waited for the pages to dry. He read each one slowly, carefully reconstructing her final days. There were references to St. Sebastian Holdings, a company he had never heard of, but one that appeared repeatedly in her notes, always circled in red ink, always connected to other shell corporations with similarly biblical names. Marta had traced wire transfers through fake charities in Utrecht, Eindhoven, and Rotterdam, all funneling money to a central account under the name Gabriel M. It was no coincidence. It was a web. He dug into the archives and found a match: Gabriel Mertens, a former city planning advisor, who had resigned quietly in 2004 after a sudden inquiry into missing municipal funds. No charges were ever filed. Mertens disappeared from public view shortly after. The press forgot him, but Elias remembered. Mertens had been cunning, always keeping his hands clean, delegating the dirty work to contractors and middlemen. If Marta had uncovered new evidence linking him to the current administration, it would be more than enough motive for murder. The next morning, Elias followed the trail to a derelict building near the harbor that matched the address listed on one of Marta's pages. It looked abandoned, graffiti-tagged walls, broken windows, but inside, the dust told a different story. A path had been cleared through the debris, leading to a locked steel door in the basement. When he picked the lock and stepped through, he found what looked like a forgotten archive room. Stacks of file boxes, a safe bolted to the concrete, surveillance monitors still running. It wasn't just an old office, it was an active operation. He photographed everything, careful not to touch more than necessary. One file contained building permits for properties that didn't exist, issued in the names of recently deceased citizens. Another showed blueprints of new city developments with inflated budgets. It was systematic theft. The safe, however, was what drew his full attention. The copper key fit perfectly. Inside were more files, hard drives, and something far more personal: a framed photo of Mertens shaking hands with the current deputy mayor. The date on the plaque read April 2009. Elias stared at it for a long time. He hadn't expected it to go that high. Back in his car, he called his superior, Captain DeLange, and began to explain what he had found. But the line went silent halfway through. Then it cut off completely. Minutes later, his phone buzzed, a blocked number. A voice spoke, calm and cold. "You're in over your head, Inspector. Walk away, or you'll end up like Marta." Elias sat frozen for a moment, the phone still pressed to his ear after the line went dead. He was being watched. He knew then that this wasn't just about Marta, or even Mertens. It was about the people who had let this rot fester, who had grown rich behind the scenes while selling the city piece by piece to the highest bidder. And now they knew he was getting close. He didn't go home that night. Instead, he checked into a small hotel under a false name and began compiling the evidence on a secure drive. He made 3 copies and mailed them to former colleagues he trusted, people who had left the force before the politics got too deep. If something happened to him, he needed the truth to survive. The next day, an unmarked van followed him for 6 blocks. Then a man in a suit tried to approach him in the station garage. Elias didn't wait to see what would happen. He got in his car and drove, no destination, just away. Every corner of the city felt tainted now. The canals, the churches, the brown brick apartments that lined the streets, all of it was part of the same quiet betrayal. But he wasn't finished. Not yet. He still had Marta's notes. He still had the safe's contents. And he still had his badge, at least for now. Elias knew there was no returning to his old life, not with the names he now carried in his head and the hard drive tucked beneath the floorboard of his car. The corruption he had unearthed stretched far beyond Gabriel Mertens. Marta had been close, agonizingly close, and the city had repaid her devotion with silence and a blade to the throat. Elias wasn't going to let her death be reduced to another cold case buried under bureaucratic dust. He drove toward The Hague under the cover of night, the wind buffeting his old Opel as it sped past farm fields and windmills shrouded in mist. He knew a journalist there, Koen van der Velde, one of the few left who hadn't sold his integrity for a seat at the political table. If anyone could bring the files into the light without being bought or silenced, it was Koen. He arrived at a safe house Koen used for sensitive work, a modest flat above a bakery that smelled faintly of yeast and burnt coffee. Koen didn't ask questions at first. He simply opened the door, took one look at Elias's haggard face, and locked the deadbolt behind him. Over cheap tea and the glow of a single desk lamp, Elias laid out everything: the safe's contents, the photograph of Mertens and the deputy mayor, the shell companies, the phantom buildings. Kuhn's expression shifted from skepticism to disbelief to quiet fury. He had written about corruption before, but nothing of this magnitude. Nothing this organized. It wasn't just a scandal. It was a criminal empire stitched into the very fabric of Dutch urban planning, and Elias was walking proof that someone in power was willing to kill to keep it secret. Kuhn agreed to go public, but not immediately. They needed time. Time to cross-reference names, verify bank records, and consult independent analysts. A premature leak would only give the guilty time to cover their tracks or manipulate the narrative. While Kuhn coordinated with a small circle of allies in the press, Elias returned to Amsterdam under yet another alias. He rented a flat on the outskirts of the city and shaved his beard. He changed cars. He used burner phones. Every instinct from his early years in narcotics kicked in. Surveillance was constant. He spotted the same blue sedan parked across from his building 3 nights in a row, the same man reading the same newspaper at the corner cafe. Still, he persisted. He found a second witness, an accountant who had worked for one of the fake charities before realizing her reports were being altered after submission. Her name was Elsie Brandt. She was scared but agreed to speak, providing documents that matched the ledgers found in the safe. Her statements confirmed the depth of the fraud and identified more officials involved. 2 from Utrecht, 1 from Haarlem, and disturbingly, a senior member of the National Zoning Commission. The implications were staggering. Elias began to understand why Marta had kept everything so secret. She hadn't trusted anyone. Then came the fire. The safe house Kuhn had used for years went up in flames 2 nights after Elsie's testimony was recorded. No casualties, but everything inside was destroyed. It was a warning. Kuhn vanished immediately, going off the grid without a word, leaving Elias with no way to contact him. The drive had been backed up, but the primary files were gone. Still, Elias pressed forward. He arranged a meeting with a contact at Europol, someone he had helped years ago during a smuggling bust in Rotterdam. The meeting was scheduled to take place at a quiet bar near Schiphol Airport. Elias arrived early, scanning the faces around him, looking for signs of recognition or intent. None came, but the contact never showed. Instead, a folded note was slipped under his glass. "Leave now. You're being watched." The walls were closing in. He could feel it. Every move he made was anticipated. Every call intercepted. Every attempt to get the evidence to someone with power was met with silence, or, worse, betrayal. Even his own precinct had grown cold. His desk had been cleared, his name erased from the internal roster. It was official. Elias Vermeer no longer existed in the eyes of the police. He had been erased. A ghost. That night, as he sat alone in the shadows of a warehouse along the IJ River, Elias realized he had one final move left. He wasn't going to win by fighting through the system. It was compromised at every level. But he could make the truth undeniable. He uploaded a heavily redacted version of Marta's notes, the photographs, the financial trails, and Elsie's testimony to an anonymous server connected to a whistleblower platform. He titled it The Hollow City. Within hours, forums lit up. Journalists, conspiracy theorists, and independent investigators across Europe began dissecting the data. By morning, the story broke. Headlines blared across screens. Amsterdam corruption network exposed, killing the truth. The Marta de Vries files, police insider speaks out, then disappears. The deputy mayor held a press conference, his smile thin and forced. He called the documents fabricated, and the investigation politically motivated. But the damage had been done. An independent inquiry was launched. Protests erupted across city halls. Marta's name was on the lips of thousands. Elias watched it all from a safe house in Belgium, a rented farmhouse far from the eyes of the Dutch state. He knew better than to expect justice to fall cleanly into place. There would be spin. There would be attempts to bury the truth again. But the files were out. The rot had been dragged into the daylight. He remembered Marta's words from one of the few messages she had sent before her death. "You can't kill the truth. You can only delay its arrival." He lit a cigarette with trembling fingers, not from fear, but relief. His face was no longer on any official roster. His badge was gone. His city had turned its back. But for the first time in months, he felt at peace. Because someone somewhere would read the story. And someone else would pick up where he left off. The truth had a pulse again. And that was enough. Let's jump to next story. Story 9. The rain fell in slow sheets over Rotterdam that November evening, softening the glint of neon signs and soaking the cobblestones in the Oud Haven. Detective Anouk Visser stood beneath the orange awning of a shuttered coffee house, her breath misting in the cold air as she scanned the entrance to the harbor's pier. The call had come in anonymous, of course it had. A voice with a thick Limburg accent warning her that the body of a man named Marco Verlet, a missing civil engineer for the Ministry of Infrastructure, was lying in a container due to be shipped to Tallinn. No names. No threats. Just coordinates and a warning. Check before they seal it. After that, no one finds him again. That was 20 minutes ago. The area was quiet, too quiet for a Friday night near the marina. As if the entire quarter knew something was about to happen, and instinctively decided to clear out. Anouk moved quickly, her boots thudding over the dockwood as she descended into the container yard. Her torchlight sliced through the shadows of stacked freight boxes, dull metal hulks labeled in faded stencils. Hamburg Sud Maersk CMACGM. The one she was looking for sat in row C, number 091248. She pressed her gloved hand against the handle, noting that the lock had been cut recently. The seal dangled loose, confirming the tip had some legitimacy. She opened the doors slowly, her light bouncing off the metallic interior and settling on a pair of leather shoes protruding from behind a shipment of steel beams. As she stepped inside, the smell hit her, old blood, sweat, and something faintly chemical. Marco Verlet's body lay face down in a pool of blackening fluid, his hands bound behind him with contractor's tape, a piece of blue plastic wedged between his teeth to keep him from screaming. A quick glance confirmed the ID tucked into his breast pocket. Whoever had done this didn't try to hide him. This was a message. By the time the forensics team arrived, Anouk had already secured the perimeter and called in backup from the organized crime unit in The Hague. There were signs of a struggle, bruising on the knuckles, defensive wounds along the forearms, but no murder weapon. The coroner's preliminary assessment suggested blunt force trauma to the base of the skull, followed by post-mortem staging. Not a robbery. Not a random act. Execution. The twist came the next morning when a routine scan of Verlet's work emails, done at Anouk's insistence, revealed he had flagged several irregularities in the bidding process for a major infrastructure project in Utrecht. Millions of euros in untraceable tenders, shadow companies out of the Antilles, and unusually fast approvals from a municipal oversight board. A week before his disappearance, he had tried to schedule a meeting with the General Inspectorate. The meeting never happened, and no one had reported him missing, not even his employer. Anouk felt the weight of it settling on her like the damp chill that clung to the Rotterdam air. This wasn't about a disgruntled employee or mob violence. This was systemic. Someone had silenced Verlet to bury a trail that led up through government and into the machinery of EU-funded development. The deeper she dug, the more resistance she faced. Her request to seize Verlet's home laptop was denied. His wife, a timid woman with dark circles beneath her eyes, claimed she had handed over all work-related devices to his boss. That boss, a polished bureaucrat named Peter Smallenbroek, refused to cooperate, citing data protection law and ongoing review. Every door she knocked on came back bolted with red tape and legal ambiguity. Until one didn't. An email appeared in her inbox late Sunday night. No sender. No subject line. Just a single sentence. If you want to know why Marco died, look into Batuwe Plan Phase 3. Attached was a scanned memo dated 2 years prior, showing that Verlet had been assigned to review feasibility reports for an expansion of the freight railway between Rotterdam and Germany. The project had been championed as a win for sustainability, designed to cut road congestion and carbon emissions. But the document included a note in Verlet's handwriting. Numbers falsified. Noise impact reports altered. Follow the contractor, NVDL Group. NVDL Group. Anouk recognized the name. A shell company based out of Amsterdam's Zuida's business district, rumored to have ties to Eastern European laundering networks. No convictions. No proven links. Just whispers and archived audits. She ran their name through Interpol's watch system and got a partial hit. A Czech informant had once mentioned NVDL in connection with a bribery scheme involving Romanian customs officials. The trail was cold, but it was something. She requested financial records, but days passed and no files came. Her own supervisor told her to drop the conspiracy theory and stick to the homicide. That was when she knew. Someone in her department had already been paid. Anouk did what few detectives dared to do. She went dark. She turned off her official phone, ditched her badge, and began running her investigation out of a friend's apartment in The Hague. With a burner laptop and a prepaid SIM, she contacted an ex-analyst from the Ministry of Finance, a whistleblower who'd fled after exposing embezzlement inside the Transport Directorate. The The woman, who now lived under a new identity in Antwerp, confirmed what Anouk suspected. NVDL Group had secured multiple high-budget projects over the last 5 years despite having no public portfolio, using consultants with fake credentials and forged environmental studies to justify fast-track permits. The reason no one looked deeper? Their accounting always matched. Clean. Perfect. Too perfect. Verlet had likely found the inconsistency, the one real number buried in thousands of false ones, and that discovery had signed his death warrant. By week's end, Anouk had gathered enough to write a preliminary report. She encrypted it, printed it, and mailed 3 copies. One to a trusted investigative journalist in Utrecht, one to a contact in Europol, and one to the National Ombudsman. She had no idea which, if any, would survive the filters and delays sure to follow. But she had to try. That night, as she returned to her car parked in a dark side street near the Erasmusbrug, she found her tires slashed, and a single red envelope wedged beneath the wiper blade. Inside was a photograph of her, standing at Verlet's container the night it was opened. Someone had been watching since the very beginning. The photo shook Anouk more than she expected. Not because she feared being watched, she had accepted that risk the moment she disobeyed protocol, but because it confirmed that whoever orchestrated Marco Verlet's death was not only aware of her movements, but one step ahead. She stared at the grainy image, printed in black and white, clearly captured from a distance through a long lens. The timestamp in the lower corner read 2018, the precise moment she'd knelt next to the body in the container. The envelope had no return address, no message, just that single photograph. But it spoke volumes. This wasn't merely a warning, it was a claim. We see you. We let you see him. Now back off. But instead of fear, Anouk felt a renewed fire rise within her. If they were watching, it meant they were nervous. The next day, she crossed into Belgium using an old border pass and met the whistleblower again, this time in a tucked-away bookshop in Ghent. They spoke in hushed tones between stacks of political thrillers. The woman, who introduced herself only as Renée, handed over a USB drive. It's all the original audit reports from Batuwayplan, she said. The unaltered ones. Marco wasn't just right. He was about to expose the contractor funnel. Look at the timelines. Look at when NVDL appears and where the money disappears. Anouk tucked the drive into her coat without looking at it. She knew Renée had taken a risk by even meeting her, and time was of the essence. The moment she returned to The Hague, she opened the files on an air-gapped laptop. What she found chilled her to the bone. NVDL Group was receiving multi-million euro contracts from Dutch and EU infrastructure funds for work that, on paper, had been completed by subcontractors across Europe. Except the subcontractors didn't exist. Not really. Their business addresses were P.O. boxes in Luxembourg, their websites barely functional, their listed employees suspiciously untraceable. It was a carousel of paper companies laundering public money under the guise of green development. Marco Verlet had stumbled on this during a routine inspection, when soil samples from a supposed test site didn't match the logged coordinates. He started digging, traced the anomalies back to the financials, and prepared to make a formal complaint. But before he could, he vanished. Anouk compiled everything, the fake reports, the shell firms, the internal emails she had retrieved through back channels, and even the photo of herself with the red envelope. She had enough for a case, if not in court, then certainly in the court of public opinion. She sent an encrypted dossier to Peter Smallenbroek, Verlet's former boss, with a single line. If anything happens to me, this goes to Der Spiegel, Le Monde, and NRC. Less than an hour later, her burner phone rang. Unknown number. A male voice spoke, low and flat. You should come to Utrecht. I think we can talk now. The meeting took place in a nondescript office above a closed sushi restaurant. Smallenbroek looked tired, older than the photos on his ministry's website suggested. He didn't shake her hand. You weren't supposed to see that container, he began, and Anouk raised an eyebrow. So you did know? He sighed. Not at first. But after it was found, people started pressuring me to keep things quiet. I didn't know what Marco had been looking into. I thought he'd gone off the rails. You thought he was disposable. Anouk interrupted. No, I thought he'd uncovered something dangerous. And I was right. Smallenbroek handed her a file, his own internal correspondence with upper-level ministry officials. It confirmed that complaints from Verlet had been intercepted and inquiries erased from the system. They wanted it buried, said it was too big to expose, that too many people, including from Brussels, had signed off. He looked at her then, truly looked. Do you think they'll let this go public? Anouk smiled without warmth. They won't have a choice. Within 48 hours, her findings hit the media. The journalist in Utrecht published the first story. By the end of the week, more followed. NRC ran a piece connecting the fraud to EU cohesion fund abuse. Le Monde investigated the contractor chain across Eastern Europe. The European Anti-Fraud Office, OLAF, launched a probe. Arrests began. A junior official in the Ministry of Infrastructure turned up dead. An apparent suicide. Smallenbroek resigned. But the shadow network that had operated so cleanly for years was finally unraveling. Still, there was no joy in the victory. Anouk remained under protection. Her apartment had been ransacked 2 days after the story broke. She moved frequently, never staying in one place for long. In March 2013, she received another envelope. No photo this time. Just a card. Blank, except for 4 words typed in a narrow serif font. Rotterdam. Not over yet. The message was clear. The game was still on. Let's jump to next story. Story 10. The rain didn't stop falling in Rotterdam the night Willem Koss was murdered, as if the sky itself grieved the city's unraveling sense of order. His body was found slumped in his Mercedes-Benz G-Class outside a Marina warehouse in Katendrecht, his mouth taped shut and 3 bullet wounds in his chest, 2 neat entries, one through the heart. There was no sign of forced entry, no immediate evidence beyond the puddles rippling beneath the car door, and the faint scent of gunpowder mingling with gasoline. To the outside world, Willem Koss was a logistics entrepreneur, owner of Kosmar BV, a mid-sized firm contracted for EU port expansion projects. But to those who moved in the half-light of Rotterdam's expanding criminal underbelly, he was the fixer, the man who greased permits, laundered cash, and when necessary made people disappear. Detective San Dijkstra stared at the scene under the low glow of street lamps, her coat soaked despite the plastic canopy held over her by a rookie officer. The forensics team moved with the quiet detachment of those familiar with this type of violence, but San knew this wasn't routine. The execution-style shooting, the location, and the victim, it all screamed message. She'd investigated Koss years before, back when he was linked to a port bribery scandal, but no charges had stuck. Too many missing witnesses. Too many anonymous bank accounts. But the world had changed since 2010. The port had doubled in size. China had invested heavily. And rumors swirled that Rotterdam had become a key node in something more than just container shipping. Something deeper, darker, and infinitely harder to trace. Back at the station, San reviewed his call records. The last number dialed before Koss died was registered to a burner phone that pinged only once, at 2203 near Walhaven, then never again. No texts, no photos, no data. It was as if the caller vanished into thin air. She pulled Koss financials next. A flagged transaction from 2 days earlier. €500,000 moved to an account in Latvia, routed through a Dutch shell company called Net Offshore Limited. She frowned. That name had surfaced in an investigation 5 months ago, connected to shipments mislabeled as construction equipment, but suspected of transporting military-grade electronics. Customs had been bribed to look away. She called her colleague in Amsterdam, Ludo van Vliet, who'd tracked Net Offshore before it went dark. Willem Koss just turned up dead, she said. He wired money to Net Offshore on Monday. Silence on the line, then Ludo's low whistle. Then someone got nervous. And if they're cleaning house, San, you're next. The following day, Interpol quietly flagged a private jet leaving Eindhoven, headed to Izmir, Turkey. Aboard was a Turkish-Dutch businessman named Haluk Demir, officially listed as CEO of a Rotterdam construction supply firm. Unofficially, he was believed to be the Dutch representative of a Eurasian smuggling network specializing in high-tech dual-use goods, equipment with both civilian and military applications, usually sourced from Eastern Europe and sold to sanctioned entities in the Middle East. Koss had handled the logistics, but now Koss was gone, and Demir was fleeing. Sen pulled the surveillance logs from Schiphol and saw something even more disturbing. Another man had flown out the day before. Peter Zeldenrust, former director of port security for Rotterdam and a known associate of Koss. He'd been on paid leave since an internal probe into missing container audits. Now he too was gone. At this point, Sen knew she wasn't just chasing a murder. She was staring at the remnants of an international laundering operation, built on stolen state contracts, and maintained by a web of legitimate companies acting as fronts. Koss's death wasn't random, it was the first domino. The files recovered from his office revealed invoices for equipment that never existed, ships that had been rerouted, and customs logs doctored from inside. But one document stood out, a list of Dutch customs officials with 3 asterisks next to certain names. At the top of that list, LD, San recognized the initials immediately. Lucien Duys, Regional Customs Director for Maasvlakte. A man who'd somehow survived 3 corruption probes, always walking free. She pulled her sidearm from her desk drawer and locked it into her hip holster. She wasn't waiting for someone else to die. She was going to Maasvlakte. It was nearly midnight when she arrived, headlights slicing through the fog as container cranes loomed like rusting giants in the distance. Dewey's office still had lights on, unusual for a man who always left by 6. When she knocked, there was no answer. She pushed the door open. Inside, the office was empty, but not unoccupied. A laptop sat open on the desk, its screen displaying a live feed of the port, specifically Berth 14A, where a container ship labeled SS Ardalan was offloading cargo. San zoomed in on the feed. Men in high-vis jackets were unloading crates marked as water filtration units. She knew better. Those weren't water systems. They were something else. A sound behind her, floorboards creaking. She spun, gun drawn. A figure stood in the doorway, calm, dressed in a dark trench coat, holding up both hands. "Easy, Reacher," he said in a thick Flemish accent. "You're making a lot of noise for someone dancing this close to fire." She kept her gun level. "Who the hell are you?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped into the light. Mid-40s, salt and pepper hair, tired eyes. "Let's just say I work for people who don't want the wrong cargo reaching the wrong shores. And right now, you're in a very dangerous corridor." She frowned. "You killed Kas?" "No," the man said. "We watched him die." Sen didn't lower her gun. She studied the man's expression, the way his fingers curled slightly as if ready to draw a weapon, the subtle alertness in his posture that betrayed training. "Who do you work for?" she asked, her voice low. The man gave a thin smile. "Let's say I work in counterproliferation. Governments don't like to admit people like me exist. We mop up the messes they pretend aren't real." He motioned to the screen. "That container ship is carrying components for drone systems, thermal optics, encrypted communications modules, signal jammers. None of it declared. None of it legal. And Kas?" He thought he could skim off the top without anyone noticing. San's mind raced. "So what? You're just here to let it pass through." He shook his head. "We're letting you clean it up." Before she could respond, the screen flickered and then blacked out. The man cursed and reached for the laptop. "They're jamming the feed." Outside, a distant rumble, metal crashing against metal, echoed across the port. San and the man exchanged glances. "They're not waiting," he muttered. "They're moving the cargo now." San bolted out of the office, the man right behind her. Down at the port, shadows moved swiftly between stacks of containers. A forklift, headlights off, was maneuvering a single large crate toward a waiting truck with falsified logos. San pulled out her phone and dialed her partner, Niels, but there was no signal. The jamming wasn't just for cameras. It was for communications, too. The trench coat man stopped abruptly and pointed. "That's the crate. If it gets loaded, it's gone. You won't see it again." San didn't hesitate. She sprinted forward, heart hammering, ducking behind crates, ignoring the rain now turning to sleet. As she neared the truck, she saw one of the men loading the crate pull out a suppressed pistol. She fired first. One shot to the shoulder, he dropped with a cry. Chaos erupted. Another man fired back from behind the truck. The trench coat stranger dove to the side, returning fire with military precision. San advanced, her sidearm barking twice more. The forklift driver reversed wildly, slamming into a stack of crates and tipping them over with a crash that shook the dock. Sirens, at last, wailed in the distance. But San knew they'd be late. After the shootout, there were 2 bodies, one wounded, and the crate left behind. Customs police, once they arrived, swarmed the area and tried to contain the scene. But San could see the unease in their eyes. They knew this had escalated far beyond local jurisdiction. The wounded man, a Dutch national with ties to a company called Veer Global BV, refused to speak even under pressure. The truck's paperwork was blank, and the forklift operator vanished into the maze of containers. The trench coat man handed her a flash drive. Inside the crate are components traceable to a German defense contractor. "This," he said, tapping the drive, "links Kas, Demir, and Duys to a ring that's been operating for nearly a decade." San hesitated. "Why not just blow the whistle yourself?" He gave her a look. "Because whistleblowers get buried. Investigators survive." Sometimes. Over the next 2 weeks, the fallout was swift. Lucien Duis was found dead in his summer home in Zeeland, apparent suicide, though San had her doubts. Demir was intercepted at the Turkey-Syria border and quietly extradited under sealed EU orders. Vir Global was dissolved overnight, its assets seized. But Kasa's legacy didn't end with arrests. As San dug deeper into his files, she uncovered a labyrinth of off-the-books logistics, crypto transactions, and false front companies spanning the Netherlands, Germany, and Romania. It was a map of a different kind of warfare, a financial war waged with invoices instead of bullets, where borders were lines of convenience and identities changed with each transaction. She compiled her findings into a report that she sent to The Hague, bypassing Dutch intelligence entirely. She knew someone in the EU Commission would want to read it, someone who still believed in cleaning rot from the inside. But the man in the trench coat was never seen again. His name never appeared in any official document. And when San asked Interpol's Dutch liaison about counterproliferation operatives, she was met with a blank stare and the words, "That division doesn't exist." Still, sometimes when she drove past the port at night and watched the ships drift into the North Sea, she wondered how many more crates had slipped through, how many more Kos-like figures were out there, running entire operations under the radar. For all she knew, she'd only scratched the surface. The Netherlands in 2015 wasn't just a gateway for goods, it had become a passageway for secrets. And in that fog of commerce, murder, and silence, one woman with a badge and a gun had briefly caught a glimpse of the machinery behind the illusion. Not enough to stop it, but enough to remember.